Hi everybody, this is going to be a series about the modules that make up most jazz standards. This is not going to be an exhaustive thing. I'm not going to list literally every chord progression in every tune, but these are common progressions that you may notice and should probably start to notice in commonplace jazz standards, bop tunes and things like that. Okay, so we're going to talk about my favourite thing, turnarounds. There's an endless variety of turnarounds in jazz, and I can hardly expect to cover them all in a video of this length, but I'm going to whiz through the most common varieties. So first of all, what is a turnaround? Well, a turnaround is what happens when you have something that ends up on, usually on a 5 chord, on a sort of hanging chord. So it's kind of the opposite of the cadence, which starts on a hanging chord and kind of just goes to a static chord, usually 1. So the simplest kind of turnaround, which is probably one you're used to in a blues, is when you have a 12-bar blues. Put a 5 chord at the end, and of course, there's classic blues turnarounds like that kind of stuff, right? So the concept of turnaround, I think, is reasonably familiar to anybody who's played like blues. So in jazz, probably the simplest turnaround that we've got is a diatonic turnaround. Every chord belongs to the prevailing key. So in the case of C major, it would be C6, A minor, D minor, G7. Old-fashioned, for instance. Okay, this is a chord progression that comes up a lot. It is actually the first 2 bars of rhythm changes. Should be a diatonic turnaround if you're going to play rhythm changes in the style of Charlie Parker, for instance. Note that the second chord is an inversion of the first. A minor 7 and C6 are the same, but with a different bass note. Then we get a 2-5. And there's a minor equivalent, which, depending on what you do, it could be C minor 6, A half diminished, again 2 inversions of the same chord, D minor 7 flat 5, G7. Or these kind of descending bass line minor turnarounds, which are very old school, like Topsy and things like that from the 1930s and early 40s. But most of what we're going to do today will be focusing on the major turnarounds because they're the most common, and also, there's a lot of them. One of the simplest ways to just modify the standard diatonic turnaround is to use a secondary dominant. And the most common secondary dominant to use, which is a secondary dominant, by the way, is a dominant which doesn't normally belong to the key. So in this case, we usually just turn the A minor 7 into an A7 by raising, in this case, the C up to a C sharp, so it's the third of the chord, right? You want to be careful to do that only on tunes where that doesn't clash with the melody. So if the melody is on a C, you don't want to do that really. I mean, you can use a sharp 9 chord there, but it's a little bit lacking in style, I think, or at least that's what I was taught, mostly by Barry Harris. Only use the A7 if the melody permits it, which is basically if it's on any note apart from the root note of the key. So for a rhythm changes, normally we'd have a diatonic turnaround, and then second one, the A7. And in fact, actually, more common is this variation of the secondary dominant turnaround, which is called I call it a turn back. I think the expression turn back and turn around are fairly interchangeable, but for me, the turn back, I'm using it here to mean a progression that starts not on the 1 chord, as both our turnarounds have so far, but actually on the 3, which is a related chord to the C major. And then we get 2, 2, 5s like that. And at the end of a tune, it's quite common to sort of have that go round and round. So at the end of a song, you go. For instance, for a cheesy jazz ending, you might have something like that. So the turn back's a very useful thing to know. All these progressions can be tritone substituted, for instance. So I'm just, instead of going in fourths, this is a fourth-wise chord progression, it's a back cycling chord progression, a cycle 4. electric dad gave. Okay, you can just go E minor 7, E flat 7, D minor, D flat 7, C major, like that for instance. And if you're playing rhythm changers, it's kind of a diatonic turnaround and a turn back. So. And it's a four and back, which we'll talk about in the next video. An all dominant turnaround is quite a nice one. So you can obviously start on the 1 for this, and then just turn every other chord into a dominant. For instance, that's quite nice. Or for instance, in Misty, you have the all dominant turnaround starting on 3/7. Diatonic, right? Diatonic turnaround. And then E7, A7, D7, G7, 13th in this case. And this note, the E, the third of the key, stays as a pedal throughout that progression. It's a really nice one to use if you find yourself in that situation. You can also tritone substitute it as well. So on, right? One of the most common ones, especially in like pre-war standards, is the diminished turnaround. And this one doesn't necessarily get covered that much compared to the 1/6-2-5 turnarounds and the 3/6-2-5s that I've just talked about. In this case, it's like 3 flat 3 2 5, and instead of playing a tritone substitution on the flat 3, we're going to use a diminished chord instead. And it sounds like this. This is useful when the melody is sitting on the C. So I suppose if we've got a C on top of it, then it becomes kind of an inverted C major chord, really, doesn't it? You can keep the C on top. And obviously not for the G7. So, it's quite common to come across things like this. Goes down to 7th, and then 2/5, right? You find them at T for 2, Out of Nowhere, Pennies from Heaven, I Can't Give You Anything But Love, Basin Street Blues, all sorts of stuff. It's a very, very common chord progression in that era of music, and it has a lovely sort of old-timey sort of feel. The interesting thing about diminished chords is they can go both ways. So this one isn't actually functioning like a dominant because it's descending by half steps in its minor chord. But you can flip it around, go the other way. So there's a Barry Harris thing. I mean, there often is a Barry Harris thing, which kind of makes that really plain. So for instance, if I take the D minor 7 chord, we can think of that as being an F6. And if I take the C6, we go from, this is another version of F6, we go from, you notice, if we go from F6 to C6, we have this, two of the notes stay the same, and then we have this kind of travelling chromatic movement going up and down like that. So it's like this, just... And this is an interesting thing. It basically means that the kind of two chords, kind of the diminished chord there is kind of the midpoint between those two things, which could either be C6, if we're using an inverted C6 over E, and D minor 7 stroke F6. Okay, so that's quite an interesting little thing to think about. But it does mean we can turn it around. So we can go, for instance, D minor, D sharp diminished, E minor, or C over E, okay? And in fact, you have a nice little variant of the turnaround where we're going up. C sharp diminished going to D minor, D sharp diminished, and it's not on our chart, but it might move up to E minor. Turn back. This is a nice way of playing rhythm changes, quite an old school way. Or you could use a diminished one. Okay, so those are kind of almost the stock songbooky diminished turnarounds. A lot of these don't really have minor equivalents. They're kind of mostly major key things. Oh, by the way, soloing on those, in terms of soloing on these turnarounds, actually they're all kind of interchangeable with each other, Because if you look very carefully, you can see in each of our examples on the kind of on the odd numbered bars, like 1 and 3, we have some kind of static chord. Either it will be usually a C major or a D minor. And then on the even numbered bars, we have some kind of passing chord. So actually you can just sub one in for the other and it's fine. And by the way, this thing is kind of also used in Ain't Misbehaving, Bewitched, Bothered and Bewildered, Serpent's Tooth, loads of stuff. And if we move on to colourful turnarounds, as I call them, this is one of my favourites. This is from Bess You Is My Woman Now, from Porgy and Bess, Gershwin. A C, and then we got a mode change to A flat major, which comes from C minor. G7 back to C. Now Tad Dameron substituted that with a tritone substitution at the end. He went C6, E flat 7, A flat major 7th, D7 sharp 11th. Now what's quite interesting is there's another version of that progression floating around where we go, everything's a major 7th, which is also used as well. But it depends what's going on in the melody. For this version, I think you keep the G on top. And then, which is the 5th of the key. That's quite a useful thing to be able to do. And it works all right for the major version as well. But then if you want to put the root on the top, use a second version. If you want to put the third on top, that doesn't really work. So depending on which version of the changes you want to use, might depend on your on your taste. And I think they both work pretty well with the root and the 5th. I mean, this one perhaps less. Yeah, this one doesn't work so well with the. No, it's fine. It works very well. And not so much with the last chord. Yeah, so the second one kind of works better with just like the 1 in the melody all the way through. But that's an obvious colourful turnaround, I think, that most people kind of learn about in jazz education. But it's not quite so common. Long turnarounds, these are beefed up versions of short turnarounds. So the vanilla long turnaround is 1, 4, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. It's not quite a back cycling progression. So we're kind of we're using this as a secondary dominant tritone substitution to go to E minor, A7, D. It's nice. Now for Pennies for Heaven, very often I'll play this, which is very similar apart from diminished there. E flat diminished, G7. It's a really nice progression. There's a sharp 4 turnaround where we substitute the first chord for an F sharp. This is actually quite common. You'll find it in tunes like I Thought About You, where the first chord is often swapped out from the original 1 chord to a sharp 4 minor 7 flat 5. And this is quite a common sub actually. In this case we'll get this. Now, you also get this in the end of Green Dolphin Street, at least the changes that most people play. And it's a pretty common progression in a lot of bebop era standards, sharp 4 turnaround. There's a variant of it in Starlight by Starlight where we play some kind of B7 altered chord and an E minor 7 flat 5, so an E minor 7, A7 altered, and a D half diminished again, G7, and then resolving to a major. That's the last 8 bars of Stella by Starlight. Also the A section of Woody and You. Moving on, we have this lovely variant of it called what I call the Cole Porter sharp 4 turnaround. This is not a back cycling progression. This thing is a back cycling progression. This is a chromatic descent. Now, one thing you could do is, of course, you could use the tritone sub. And that works fine. That's not what Cole Porter does. He plays this. In Night and Day, for instance. there. So you're using a minor sixth, like a modal interchange chord on the chord 4, which is beautiful. 3 is just a E minor 7, diminished on the flat 3, 2, 5, 1. Okay, and the advantage of that is you can actually keep the 1 on the melody. Apart from that chord, the G7, unless you play sus. Now, there's a variant of this where you can keep the 1 all the way through, which is what I call the Bud Powell sharp 4 turnaround. This is great. So this is only one step different from the Cole Porter. We just changed that last chord. Instead of being a G7, it's now a D flat major 7. Bud loved that chord. He loved the sharp 1 major 7, maybe with a sharp 11th instead of a dominant. So we're just going to go through that now. And then, lovely, huh? And we can resolve that to C6 if we want. And I mean, there's loads more. These videos can't really be exhaustive, but hopefully you'll see or hear some of these progressions going through the standards repertoire. Listen out for the melody, listen out for the bass. For instance, in the sharp 4 case, there's strong limitations placed on what you can use, or depending on what the melody's doing. So the melody's sitting on the 1, you have to use different chords, right? You can't use, I mean, this is all right, but this one won't work really. I suppose it's all right. But if I do the fifth wise version, that's all right. And then, but you have to change for this one. So which choices are made will usually depend on the melody. For instance, in the tune I Thought About You, we use the fourth wise version of that. Those chords are chosen because they fit the melody, which is usually the constraint for these sorts of things. But anyway, I mean, have fun with those, and I hope you find that useful. See you in the next one.